I want to welcome our viewers back to Conversations with John. And in each one of these, we have some conversations with leaders across the denomination, and we try to get some insight into how they're doing now, especially through this season of pandemic. My guest today is none other than the president of Chicago Theological Seminary, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Ray. Dr. Ray, glad to have you here. Why don't you introduce yourself to our viewers and say a couple words about who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, it is so good to be here with you in the midst of this period. And I am, of course, the president of the Chicago Theological Seminary. I'm someone who has been connected with the United Church of Christ my entire life. So it is very, very good to be here and to talk about our life together as we're moving through this time.
All right. So the first question I have for you is, as president, I'm sure that you've had over the last month or two to make some very difficult decisions. What were some of those decisions you were faced with, and what have you all resolved to do there at Chicago Theological Seminary?
Well, I think the biggest decisions that we've had to make are in terms of how we're going to be delivering our classes. Now, we've had a profile for a while that most of our classes are taught online, but what we wanted to be very careful about was as we migrated our entire curriculum online, we didn't want to do it in a way that would damage our face-to-face classes, because those are critically important to us as well. As well, I made the decision to close down the entire building because I did not want to expose any of our staff members or any of our students unnecessarily. So we've been working remotely now for about a month, and our classes will remain online for the rest of this semester, and we will remain remote at least until the middle of May. And so those were the really hard decisions that we've had to make. We're also in the midst of our budgeting season. So just having no idea what the economy is going to look like when we finally step back into some sense of normalcy has been a bit nerve-wracking.
So let me ask about that last piece. I would imagine all of our listeners and viewers are pondering the same question around economic realities and the future on the other side of this. Are you just playing a wait and see game, or are there things strategically that you and your trustees and your faculty and staff are doing to try and mitigate against any future damages in terms of your budget, your economy, your finances?
Well, we've done some emergency models that have made presumptions about what is our budget going to look like if we go into a recession. And as some people suggest, that recession may quickly lead into a depression. You know, how is that going to affect us? And for us, the biggest question, and this is something we cannot know, is what is going to be our enrollment. Because one of the downsides, and we're discovering this now, is that when the majority of your students are online, it means that they are living in place. So they are very sensitive to their local economies. And given how what's happening with local economies is affecting individuals, we don't have a way of knowing who will be able to afford to be able to register for classes, who will be able to come. And that's something that we probably won't know until sometime late July, early August. And so that's the biggest thing for us. In terms of the other modeling, we can do modeling in terms of cash flow, we can do modeling in terms of endowment, et cetera, but that one critical piece. And I think one of the things that's significantly important for us in the midst of this is one of our strategic goals has been trying to revitalize our relationship with the denomination so that we can be a partner that helps in things like the multiple paths to ministry program and whatnot. And, you know, all of that's kind of up in the air now. But our commitment is not, but the reality of what it's going to mean.
So let me ask this. Chicago Theological Seminary, as you pointed out earlier, invested in online learning ahead of the curve.
Mhm.
And so this doesn't in some ways feel like new territory to you, even though to some degree you are entering new territory. Many of our churches are almost overnight, and many of our clergy are almost overnight adjusting to online virtual realities. Are there things that you could, as Chicago Theological Seminary, say to clergy and lay leaders who are struggling to enter that world that might be helpful to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing is to actually enter the world, right? Don't try to approximate what worship service looked like in your place, but actually try to figure out what does it mean to be together and what does it mean to actually have a gathering when you are together. So, I mean, there's a way in which if you simply try to produce what you had online so that it approximately looks like what you were doing in the sanctuary, that can leave people feeling as if they're really missing something. But
Mhm.
if you shape your entire time to the reality that is in front of you, and you shape it in such a way so that where the people are at, they can feel as if they're really present and really being connected, that can make all the difference in the world. And, you know, that goes back to some advice I got very early in ministry. And an old preacher told me that when you're preaching to a congregation of 50 people, don't preach like you're preaching to 200 because it makes them feel small. Preach to make them feel as if they are the entire point and are the most important people in the world
Mm.
at this particular moment, because then they will feel as if they really are filling up the space.
That's that's wonderful wisdom. I wish somebody had shared that with me when I was a young minister. One of the things that I know is integral to the formation process at CTS is the experiential learning, the learning that the students can only get in the communities. And it's you're not only creating biblical scholars and theologians, but you're creating people who are going to make an impact in their community. Is that compromised at all by the social distancing, or are there ways that you have been able to replicate that even in virtual space?
Well, you know, there again, I think that the gift that we have is we've been doing this online for a long time, and we've developed partners in various kinds of communities where our students are located at. So certainly it's not exactly what it was, but the whole idea of online formation is not foreign to us. And because we've been able, for the most part, to be able to be present to our students in a way that they feel as if they are present to the entire community, I think that that work continues. Certainly, the pandemic has created challenges for them being able to take their learning into the world, but to the extent that they've been able to take what they've learned online in terms of practice and then replicate that for the communities that they're serving. I think that that's been a helpful thing. But there's no doubt that we've had compromises in that area.
I'm curious, just as a moment ago, we talked about the church and clergy adjusting to virtual worship. Is there such a thing as virtual advocacy? And might we be learning through this season patterns of changing the world that might be more virtual than physical? Is that possible?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think it goes back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, is that if you can create a digital space that doesn't make people feel as if they are not fully present,
Yeah.
then you can actually bring people in numbers and with the kind of passion that can actually shape and impact different kinds of policy decisions. But it all comes back to whether or not you are creating a space in which people are simply passive observers, or if you're really engaging them and inviting them to be fully present.
I want to thank you and repeat what I think is an important insight before I go to my next question. Uh, it's the critical insight that don't treat whether it's a learning environment, whether it's a worship environment, whether it's an advocacy environment, what you're doing with your audience virtually as if you just merely replicate what you would do with them physically. Treat it as if it is authentic space itself. I think that's an incredibly important insight for our viewers. I want to ask this. You and I have done a lot of shared work over the years together around racism and white privilege. We are seeing across this nation the face of racism, even in a pandemic where you could argue a virus is indiscriminate. What are you seeing through the lens of race, and what would you say to our viewers about what this means during this time of pandemic?
Well, I can answer two things. One is that, and as you know from our conversations, I'm a dyed in the wool. So I always tell people, systemic evil is not something that I'm surprised by. So
Yeah.
these numbers that we're getting, and the disproportionate number of Black people in particular, but now increasingly Latino, Latinx populations being affected in mortality, is not surprising to me. Now, the one thing that I would say to our viewers, though, is that the politics that is emerging around this, particularly in terms of people who are living in suburban, exurban, and rural areas, somehow believing that they should not bear the weight of this, means then that they're asking their sisters and brothers, their siblings, and their neighbors who live in the cities, largely people of color, to bear the entire weight of it. Because when you have things like these get back to work campaigns and whatnot, and you want to open the city up, you want to do this, the people who are going to be going back into the buildings first are the janitors and the security guards. The people who are going to be going back into retail first are going to be the sales clerks, are going to be the people who are doing support work. And in all of those areas, people of color, Black people, Latino people, other brown people are disproportionately represented. So I think a part of what I'd want to lift up to our viewers is to recognize that when you hear these calls to open the economy back up, you're actually hearing calls for us to shift the weight of this pandemic further onto the backs of the community of those who are suffering the most. And for me, that becomes what's unconscionable. I mean, because I can certainly understand concerns about the economic impact and that sort of thing, but when you have the kind of structural realities that we have, prematurely reopening the economy, prematurely trying to move back to normalcy, means that you're going to be moving back to allowing the pandemic to ravage those communities that have suffered the most already.
Wow, that's important. Thank you. One final question before we say goodbye to our viewers. Where are you seeing hope in the midst of this?
Well, I think the place that I'm seeing hope is really in two places. One is, and it's not unconnected to the last point that I just made, the numbers of people who are willing to sacrifice so that all might be well, to sacrifice so that we all might have a brighter future. And, you know, those people far outweigh the ones who just want to throw their neighbors under the bus. And I mean, so that's one place that I'm finding hope. I think another place that I'm finding hope, there is a way that this sort of digital reality, which has always been running parallel to our lived reality, the only place that people have been able to be fully present been in the gaming world when they took on pseudo identities. So as they were playing these games, right, they could be fully present as the ultimate soldier. They could be fully present as a superhero. They could be fully present in any of these other roles. And the way we normally treated digital reality was it was only proximate to where we were. So one of the things I'm seeing hope is that people are able to step into this digital space as themselves and not as some alternative identity, and do so where they can be fully present in who and what they are. because I think that holds tremendous potential for us in the future.
As always, the way your mind runs and thinks is an awe and a wonder, and I'm enriched by every conversation. I would love to continue this, but we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in once again to Conversations. I want to thank our conversation partner today, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Ray, President of Chicago Theological Seminary. And Stephen, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I think the last word is to keep hope alive, because we'll be all right.
We'll be all right. Thank you. And thank you to our viewers. We'll be back soon.